I will ask you maybe now a few, let's say, basic questions, simple question, hopefully, which will be for us, let's say, help us to understand more what is about critical thinking. So if we could start with, let's say, your definition of critical thinking, because this question, what is critical thinking, is the question which absolutely never ends. It's always looking for the best, let's say, definition, understanding at this moment. So if you can tell us a few words, what is the critical thinking for you now after so many years of experience and finding all these tools and processes, etc.?
So a rich conception of critical thinking, first we'll need to address the question, how do we unpack again the very term itself? So let's start there. Critical thinking, what do we mean by that term? Well, what do we mean by critical? What is the proper use here? The proper use is related to the term criteria. Criteria for thinking. And somebody say, well, wait a minute, critical, I thought that means something negative. I thought you were criticizing when you're critical. And the answer there is that is one use. But that is not the use here. Criticism may or may not be part of the critical thinking process, it'll all depend upon the context. So critical relates directly to criteria, meaning the criteria or standards that we should be adhering to as thinkers. So now we have the first move, criteria or standards. And then Richard asked, well, what are those? What should those even be? And then what do we mean by thinking? So there are various forms of thinking. What humans mainly do in human life is reason. And that's the use here. So when we say critical thinking, we mean critical reasoning, and we mean, therefore, standards for reasoning, or reasoning that adheres to appropriate standards. Now, you might ask, well, what are some other forms of thinking? Well, very quickly, we can be daydreaming. That's one form where it's not reasoning. We may be meditating. We may be engaging in associational thinking, in which I say, well, I'm glad that you called me from Poland. You know, Poland reminds me of the things that are happening in Europe. And that reminds me of once when I traveled in Europe and I had a good time and it was very enjoyable, but I had a lot of trouble with the subways. And you see how your mind is just bouncing all over the place. And there's nothing, as it were, wrong with that, unless you're going in some, let's say, directions that are causing you some discomfort or something like that, or you need to be reasoning through something of importance in your life. So that reasoning is central to commanding all the other forms of thinking, because your reasoning at any moment may need to step in. Even in the case of, let's say, well, what if you're relaxing and you're trying to, it's the end of the day and you've worked very hard and you just are taking a walk and you're relaxing and suddenly you start thinking of a problem at work. Well, that's when you need your critical thinking to intervene, to say, wait a minute, this is not the time. Now's the time for relaxation. Do you see? So there's a sense in which we can never get away from our reasoning. It follows us everywhere. It is carried along with us everywhere, and we mainly ignore it as humans. So that's a beginning place. So then what does critical thinking, so then Richard said, so then what are these criteria that are appropriate for thinking? And what is entailed in reasoning itself? So he looked in philosophy and he finds premises and conclusions. And he says, well, those seem to be part of our reasoning, but is that all? It seems like there's more than that to this. And well, there are concepts, aren't there? So he's reading in other books, and we're back to the 1960s, 1970s, and Richard Paul is starting to ask these questions. And other theoreticians are also approaching the question, but more in more narrow ways, and coming up with lists of ideas, many of which are sound in terms of the best theoreticians, separate from Richard Paul's work. But Richard said, well, what are the most fundamental moves, though, that we can make? And how can we create an integrated system of ideas so it's not a bunch of lists? Because we don't learn in that way. We don't think in that way. We don't think in list form. So we need a dynamic way of looking at reasoning that actually mirrors what is going on. So we know we have premises, we know we have conclusions, but what might be in premises? Let's see, how do we strip that down? Well, that seems like assumptions and maybe it also includes the information. So over time, again, Richard is pulling these elements together. He's looking out at how we actually are, what the actual parts of thinking are. And he's looking at these from a generalist perspective, not staying within the terrain of philosophy, but looking beyond that.
Mhm.
And so over time, Richard came to see 8 elements in reasoning. So he says you can boil these down to 8 elements. Yes, there are many complexities in those 8. And there are lots of complexities that people could throw at the theory, but we can start with, whenever we reason, we have a purpose, we ask questions, we use information, we make inferences based on that information and the assumptions leading to the inferences. And all of this is couched within a point of view, which is informed by our concepts and informs our concepts, all of which leads to implications and consequences. So the short list is, the elements of reasoning include purpose, question, information, inferences, concepts, assumptions, point of view, and implications. And this took Richard some years to boil the reasoning down to
I can
these 8 elements.
see huge research, many years, decades probably of research,
Yes,
finding all these, let's say, roots and materials, and boiling to only 8. So it's from very complex, let's say, information, make it so simple. It's a lifetime work, I'm sure about it.
Yes, he began with his early dissertation in 1965 at the University of California at Santa Barbara. And the theory that we're talking about here really culminates in the early 1990s. And by the way, that's when I came on board, 1992. So by then, Richard had already been working for, as you say, some decades to develop, to boil these 8 elements down. Notice that he didn't invent the elements. They were already, we were using them. We use them every day, all the time, when we're reasoning. He was just trying to figure out what they are. How do we boil these down?
We need, some kind of names. We do it a lot. We do a lot of things intuitively, but and by intuition and experience, etc. But we are lacking very often the names, the proper vocabulary. So that was the work which was missing for, let's say, 2,500 years, and it's really amazing work that it's end up with so simple and powerful tools and processes. So thank you for this introduction.
Well, let me give a little more on the introduction very quickly, and just say, in reference to what you just said, that the language of critical thinking is what we need and want to develop as aspiring thinkers and as people who are trying to become self-actualized. The language of critical thinking, this network of ideas. So just very quickly back to the core concept. So Richard said, well, what's involved in reasoning? So over time, again, he gets to the 8 elements. But he said, what's the criteria for reasoning? And then he begins again, he looks out and he looks at what standards are being used. And he says, well, philosophers are using reliability. Do the conclusions follow from the premises? So reliability is a standard. And then again, over time, he boils these down to, of course, well, let's just say he boils them down to 9 or 10 or 12 or some number of what he called perfections of thought. Now we call them intellectual standards, or we can call them critical thinking standards. And here is a short list of essential ones, and nothing could be simpler. Yeah. Make sure that your thinking is clear, accurate, relevant, deep, where you have complexities, broad, where you're facing more than one point of view, sufficient, fair, significant, relevant, logical, these justifiable. So notice again how simple this is, and how, however, these are largely missed in human life. So now we have the criteria for reasoning, standards for thinking. But then Richard went further and said, but is that all there is? What about the critical thinking person? So he said, well, of course, we need the virtues, intellectual virtues, such as intellectual empathy, intellectual integrity, intellectual courage, fair-mindedness. And to culminate the major theory, because I'm dealing with the core concepts here in our approach, and we think in any substantive conception of critical thinking. And that includes the tools I've talked about, as well as the understanding of the barriers to critical thinking, which we can put under the rough umbrellas of egocentric and sociocentric thinking. Now, all of these can be unpacked, but what I want you to notice is the the largeness of the concepts and how much mileage you could get or I could get from using these fundamental concepts. And I would say that any theory of critical thinking must address assessing thinking, analyzing thinking, and improving thinking. So if somebody comes along and says, we have tools for thinking. So how are you helping us take our thinking apart to examine it? How are you helping us properly assess reasoning? And how are you helping us improve reasoning? So if your theory of critical thinking can't do that, then we need to find the one that does.
And thank you for this, because from my point of view, I was thinking that I'm dealing with critical thinking for almost 18 years of my professional work, because it was some kind of love from first sight. And I was dealing with different thinking tools, thinking processes and cultures and theories. But actually, when I got to you in terms of your books and materials, I got the impression that this is the core, this is the real source of the critical thinking, but I wasn't ready yet to understand it, to fully grasp it, to fully digest it. And actually it took me another 3-4 years to be ready to understand the complexity and simplicity of the materials which you created in Foundation. And actually the last year when I was finishing the course in the Foundation really allowed me to fully understand how amazingly simple it is. But the other hand, amazingly, there is no limit to use it. There is no aspect of life, personal life, private life, business life, educational life, that you cannot use it. It's impossible. So this is just amazing that these brilliant, simple tools exist. So the only goal for me is now just to spread the idea in Poland as much as possible, because it can improve our life so much. It's just beyond our imagination how could better we live, how better decisions, solve conflicts, etc., we could do from the really next day after the training, because it's so simple and so ready to use. You don't have to spend years to some kind of understand it. Actually, it's prepared by you, by Foundation, in this very now easy way to take it and use it. So I can only express my, love to your materials and the simplicity of thinking now, and to work to the Richard, of course, and to you and all the Foundation trainers, consultants.